But first, I assume most of you are familiar with Philip Meyer. But for those who are not, let's say Philip Meyer was the first data journalist. He was a journalist in the 1960s in the United States, and he became famous among us data journalists for an investigation he made in 1968 that was a few months after the Detroit protests, and that's a picture from the protests at the time. And he became famous because he took a novel approach at the analysis of the protests. At the time, people were saying that that people rioted in Detroit. Black people rioted in Detroit because they were uneducated and because they were not from Detroit. And Philip Meyer thought that this explanation was not sufficient. So what he did is he designed a survey and he went to the black neighborhoods where the protests happened, and he asked people 3 questions. The first one was, did you take part in the riots? The second one was, what's your level of education? And the third one was, where were you born? And with that, he was able to show that the people who rioted were actually more educated than average, and that they were from Detroit itself, that they did not come from the South. And so that the common sense was totally wrong when it came to analyzing the protests. And after that, Meyer used his novel investigative techniques to write a book, which is the topic of my talk, to write a book that was called Precision Journalism. And for Philip Meyer, precision journalism is the idea of using the scientific method to do journalism. He wrote the book in 1969, and he wrote a new edition in 1991. So this is not new. I mean, the first edition was published 50 years ago. The second one was 30 years ago. And so, yeah, the organizers asked me to do a talk on this book. So I reread it, and I'm going to share what I found with you. So the first things are to say, wow, the book is old and it's fun. So for instance, Meyer spends, I don't know, like 5 pages explaining how magnetic tapes work to store your data. So this is an IBM machine to read magnetic tapes, but don't read too loud though, because it's still used when it comes to archiving the web. Some archiving services still use these magnetic tapes because they say it's the most reliable way of storing data for when you're talking about storing data for centuries or decades. So yeah, some of the book is not really current anymore. Another thing that's really fun is when he does a benchmark of spreadsheet software. So this is Lotus 123, which is the top spreadsheet software of 1991. And yeah, so that was the fun part of the book, and I was hoping when I started reading the book that I could do a whole talk of just making fun of how backward people were in 1991, and that would be easy, but actually it wasn't. Because most of what Meyer writes, I mean, when it comes to the substance of the book and not the tools, most of what he writes is still very current. For instance, he describes precision journalism as the process of collecting, storing, retrieving, analyzing, reducing, and communicating data. And I don't have it in the slides, but that's actually the data journalism process that we still teach today in journalism schools, even though we don't really use the storing, retrieving, and reducing data anymore, because we can do that very easily using off-the-shelf tools. But basically, the workflow that Meyer described in his book is still the workflow we use today. The other thing that was surprisingly fresh in Meyer's book is his concept of models. Meyer described models as both the hypothesis you make when you start an investigation and the data structure that you will use to store your data. And what's especially interesting in this concept is that he clearly says that depending on the model you use, you're not going to be able to ask the same questions to your data. And as I was preparing for this talk, this investigation of Reuters was published, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. And it's a clear example of the idea that Meyer was writing about 30 or 50 years ago. So Shock Tactics is an investigation by Reuters in which they counted how many people had been killed by tasers since the year 2000. And what's interesting is that the company that sells tasers, which is called Axon, already provided the data. And they said that since 2000, 24 people had died because of tasers. And Reuters decided to change the model and maybe to look at the issue in a different light and to use different sources of data to provide an answer. And they found that I think 1,005 people had died since 2000 because of tasers, which is 50 times more than what the official number was. And what they did is, instead of looking at the autopsy reports only, they looked at a whole lot of other data sources to qualify a death as taser related, because, and that's what started their change of model, that's what started their hypothesis, because Axon, the company that sells tasers, will sue a hospital that writes taser in the autopsy report. So based on this, they had the idea for a new hypothesis, they changed the model, and they came closer to the truth. So yeah, that's a small example of what precision journalism or data journalism can do. And just to make things even clearer, I'd like to compare that to non-scientific, non-precision journalism. And I want to illustrate my point by taking an example from a story by Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize winning American journalist. He wrote a story on the killing of Osama bin Laden, I think it was 2 years ago, in the London Review of Books, and this is a picture of the house where bin Laden was staying in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And what's interesting is that someone like Seymour Hersh, who is a very prestigious journalist, could write a very long story based on anonymous sources and based on things he considers facts, but that you cannot check. So his process of arriving to the truth is not replicable, it's not falsifiable, and in the end, it's not scientific. There is no way for the reader to verify what Seymour Hersh is writing, and so in terms of getting closer to the truth, it doesn't really help, because whether or not you believe what Seymour Hersh is writing is a matter of personal opinion. There is absolutely no way to reliably know if Hersh is saying the truth. So this kind of non-scientific journalism, again, when it comes to finding the truth, when it comes to coming closer to the truth, is only helpful insofar as it lets us formulate new hypotheses, insofar as it lets us imagine new models. And that's where I want to go to the topic of my talk, which is the relationship between academia and journalism, because Meyer that's another point he makes in the book. He says that because precision journalism aims at coming closer to the truth in a scientific way, it must have a close relationship to universities. It must have a close relationship to academia, because academia is also interested in finding the truth. And he wrote that 50 years ago, and I tried to find out if that made sense, or if maybe he was wrong. The first thing that I thought about when I read that is the projects that we did, where we tried to work with academics on journalism projects. And I'm sure you've heard lots of stories yesterday of collaborations between journalists and academics, and there are other panels on the topic today, but I'm still going to give you my 2 stories on the issue. The first thing that I noticed when working with academics is that academics tends to they want to go fast, they want to publish fast, because they want to be the first ones to put their name under a keyword, so that they will get a lot of citations later on. And the thing is, I mean, journalists also want to publish fast, but it's not the same idea of fast. When an academic wants to publish fast, she'll want the paper to be published 1 year or 2 years from now, and journalists are obviously want to publish faster. And the problem is that, again, it's an experience we had. The academic doesn't want you to publish anything before her paper has been published, because she might fear that someone else uses the idea to be the first to publish under the specific keyword that the academic was hoping to have for herself. So yeah, it makes collaboration difficult. And another roadblock that we had when working with academics was the relationship to data. As journalists, obviously we're interested in collecting data when we run an experiment, collecting user data, but we're mostly interested in making the user happy, because a happy user is a user who shares the story on Facebook, and that's what most journalists are after. But when an academic decides to design an experiment and collect user data, they sometimes want to collect as much data as possible so that they can test as many hypotheses as possible, so that at the end, one of the hypotheses will pass the p-value under, with the p-value under 0.01, so that they can have a paper published. And in concrete terms, it leads to this. This was interesting because it was a project we did in Switzerland. It's a dialect quiz. I'm sure you saw the German dialect quiz that was published in 2015 by Spiegel. We did the same thing in French-speaking in Switzerland. And what's interesting is that we did this project, and exactly at the same time a university did the same, so we can compare both approaches. So that was our dialect quiz. It's fairly straightforward. Well, the network is not very fast, but basically it's your typical dialect quiz. You answer questions about how you speak French in this case, and we tell you where you're from based on how you speak. And what's interesting is to take a look at what the academics did. It's not the same kind of user experience. So you start with this, and then you have to answer something like 30 questions, and then you can actually play. So obviously, it's not the same kind of experience for the user. It's not the same. You're not going to reach as many people when you take the academic approach. But yeah. Again, we've all heard these stories, but my question is, are we having problems to collaborate because it's new and because we're not used to it and because we haven't found the best practices that will let us do great collaborations? Or maybe there is something else, because again, the book by Philip Meyer, where he was writing that journalists and academics were meant to work together, this book was published 50 years ago, and 50 years is a long period of time to find out the best way to work together. And so the argument or the hypothesis I wanted to discuss with you is that maybe we're not meant to work together. Let's take things backwards. If journalists and academics were meant to work together, we should find journalists and academics publishing together in academic journals or publishing together peer-reviewed papers. And the good news is that it's happening. You have people who do that. On the left here is Ben Goldacre. He's a British journalist, and he publishes in his domain, which is mostly medicine, I believe. He does publish papers. And on the right is Susan McGregor. She's an American security researcher, and she's also a journalist who, again, publishes with academics. So it is happening. You have some journalists who work together with academics and vice versa. Same thing, if we take things backwards, if journalists are meant to work with academics, we should find examples of experiments that are designed and run jointly by newsrooms and universities. And again, I found some examples. This is, for instance, INVID. It's a project by Agence France Presse and a few universities in Europe. They collaborate to create, something to check fake news. Le Monde, which is a French daily, also collaborate with universities to find tools to improve their fact-checking efforts. But what's interesting in these projects is that all of them are heavily subsidized. Newsrooms and universities will only get together if they are paid to do so, and the kind of money that we're talking about is a lot of money by newsroom and university standards. I haven't been able to find a single experiment that was done without a subsidy. And finally, the third thing that we should have had if journalists and universities were meant to work together would have been conferences. And as you are aware, this is the first journalism meets academia conference that we have in Europe. This doesn't fit the hypothesis that Meyer was making 50 years ago. And so maybe we should change the model that Meyer was using when he wrote that journalists and academics were meant to work together. Before making a new hypothesis, I'd like to show you a domain, show you a way in which the relationships between universities and academia work very well, and this is when a university or an academic publishes a press release, and when newspapers republish it without asking too many questions. I showed you examples of journalists collaborating with academics together. I told you about Ben Goldacre and Susan McGregor. It took me about 2 full days to find them. When I looked for a news article based on a press release by a university in a French news magazine, it took me about 10 seconds to find one. And this was published, I think, the day before yesterday. You have an article so that's, I think, one of the largest French news magazine. You have an article that says there is like a maximum limit on the duration of human life, and this limit is 114.1 years for men and 115.7 years for women. This article comes from this press release from Tübingen University. The paper is actually not a paper in biology. It's actually not a paper at all. The thing has not been published. It's just a statistician who claims he wrote a paper on the topic, but there is no link, there is no peer review, it hasn't been published. So it's basically, I think it's, it's not really science, it's not really serious, but it doesn't matter. The university published a press release and the media republished it. They were not paid to republish it, they did it by themselves, so it's actually going well. I mean, this kind of relationship is going well. And the question I would like to ask is why is the relationship going so well when it comes to publishing things that are not true, and why is the relationship going not well when it comes to finding the truth? And so maybe we should consider the hypothesis that neither newsrooms nor universities are really looking for the truth, because if they were, they should be working together. It's just logic. And so I tried to find an answer to this question, and I went to the ethics of journalism. I found the Munich Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Journalists, and the first item in this declaration, which was done in 1971, but it's still used by the associations of journalists as the basic of their ethics. The first point is that journalists should respect the truth no matter what. And then I asked, well, how is it enforced? And as you all know, it's not. As a journalist, unless you engage in gross falsification like the Hitler diaries in Germany, unless you do that, you can publish something which is not true, and you're unlikely to be fired for this. I could go on in this direction, but I don't have time. But again, you have examples of, maybe not in Germany, but in France definitely, of major journalists who engaged in gross fraud and were not punished for that, but instead were promoted. And the same thing is happening in academia. The way academia works now and has been working in the past 10 or 20 years is that most of the big money is gotten from grants that are given by institutions such as the national governments or the European Union. And these grants are given for a purpose. They don't give money away by saying, oh, just do research with it. They give money away and say, you have to do innovation, you have to be successful. And so this gives academics an incentive, maybe not to lie, but they have an incentive to first provide a successful report to the funder, and second, maybe find out the truth. And again, I would need another 30 minutes to expand on this point, but it has been written about many times on how the funding of academia was broken. So maybe the hypothesis that we should make is that journalists and academia are not meant to work together because they do not share the same goal of finding the truth. If I go back to the experiment we did in Switzerland, I don't know how this thing works. If I go back to the dialect quiz that I showed you before that we did in Switzerland, at the end of the quiz, so it was very successful. I think we had about 10% of the French-speaking Swiss population who took the quiz. The Swiss public television who commissioned the quiz was extremely happy. And at the end of the quiz, we collected data to know where people were from and if the results were correct. And we had some ideas on what to do with the data. And what's interesting is that we probably collected 10 times more answers as the academics did, but we never did anything with it. Because at the end, the Swiss national television is interested in entertainment. That's the reason they paid us money, so that we would design this quiz. They're not interested in finding the truth or in doing research. So we have this trove of data which is lying there in our servers, and that's totally useless. So again, the purpose of our experiment was not truth finding, it was just entertainment. So maybe that explains why journalists and academics don't work together, and maybe it's totally normal that the successful examples of academics and journalists working together, why we have so few of these examples, and maybe as long as the incentives in the newsroom and in the university remain as they are today, maybe it will never happen that journalists and academics work together on a larger scale. So thank you for your attention, and please tell me I'm wrong. If you don't say anything, it means I'm right.
Thank you for this, critique on the working together, but I don't think it's as bad. And I want to raise one point, which was, I think, conflated in your talk, which was that people work on the same content, on the same topic. So you could pull apart the actual story, the actual data, the actual collection from the methodology. And this is how you could work together again, right? Because the academic could publish the methodology you achieve in order to get the results you want, and this methodology is not tied to this one particular example, but it's like a general purpose methodology, whereas you as a journalist could use this methodology to produce your results, your data, your articles. Would that resonate with you, or?
Sure, but can you get that published in a good journal? Just the methodology?
Yeah, of course. This is there are many fields of science. Myself, I'm working in computer science, so I can publish, the methodology to, do something, and not actually do it. In fact, if I only do this once, this is not considered a methodology.
You said that you collect a lot of data with these kind of quiz you were doing. Did you ever try to give them to the scientists, and if you maybe they can work with this and put it in their work as additional data? Or is it a little bit like it is when you talk to citizen scientists who say we are collecting data, but the real scientists are not interested in using them because they are not sure whether they have been collected properly?
So in this case, obviously I was caricaturing to make my point. In this case, the data doesn't belong to us, it belongs to the Swiss television. So we're a bit stuck. That being said, we tried that already, of collaborating post hoc. And what happened in this case, that the scientists would come up with so many methodological issues that in the end they told us that they would be happy to use the data if we do this and this and this, which obviously we didn't have the time or money to do. So it goes back to this trouble of journalists not following a methodology which is good enough for scientists.
I think there's an issue of definitions here. You looked for collaboration by looking for outputs of the process that looked like academic outputs mostly, peer-reviewed journals and so on. with a journalist and an academic on there, I think there is collaboration which is much more difficult to find, where the outputs will be journalistic outputs, where the academics may be mentioned in the bottom of the story, but they're not there. I'm an academic. I know of academic outputs where there were journalistic inputs and the journalists are not mentioned as the authors. Also, I think you need to take account of the fact that there are not just journalists and academics. This is a much bigger culture. You mentioned the issue of press releases. There's a lot of work done by a group at the University of Cardiff, led by Petrok Sumner, looking at this whole process. He's an academic psychologist, where he looks at how the whole thing fits together and how the parties are not talking to each other because there is mediation from the press officers. And also you mentioned Ben Goldacre as an example. Academics think Ben Goldacre is a journalist. Which he is, and journalists think he's an academic, which he is. And I think you need to look at this in a...
Sure.
It's very complex.
Of course, I mean, reality doesn't fit in a 30-minute talk. This being said, the issue you meant of, okay, we could have looked at how academic feed in the journalistic process. If you look at the quality of people who are invited as experts in the media, it should show that this process is broken. I mean, there are so many experts who do not have any academic qualifications, and so many academics who refuse to go on air because they know that their message is going to be transformed by the journalists. That it shows that this is also not going very well, even though I do not have any study to back my point. But I'll find some. Stefan, you wanted to say something?
Yes. So for 2 years ago there was a Datenlabor here, and there was also a speaker here presenting Jupyter notebooks, and I think they are like a good example of how academia and journalism comes a bit closer together, because they're used in both contexts to make more reproducible data analysis, and that is very relevant for academia, but also for journalism in many practical ways, not only because of transparency, but also because you want to repeat the story the next year, for example, because you want to improve your processes, because you want to be more efficient in creating your stories. And I think maybe with some tools they're growing a bit closer together, especially in the data part, because I don't know, they're both using computers to find some new ideas or get the information.
Definitely, but the point I was trying to make is more that, okay, I mean, these examples are great, and I'm sure that the people who are here at this conference will do fantastic things together, and some of my friends are academics. Okay. But my point was more, maybe we should try to look at the bigger picture, and this idea of comparing how many press releases, for instance, are being fed through the media, as opposed to actual collaborations where people work together and do more than just copy-pasting stuff. I think if we do this, and again it's a hypothesis, we will find that the order of magnitude of the number of press releases that are just copy-pasted by journalists and who that turn out to be wrong is much higher than the number of actual collaboration, even though these collaborations do exist. I'm not denying that.
Yeah, but I found the point very interesting that you made, that they have to be incentivized by money. And because right now, so the first slide shows they incentivized like a collaboration between academia and journalism, and there are like some great projects came out of that. The question is, next year, will they collaborate again on some topic without the money?
I think we both know the answer. Do we have time, or should we?
I very much enjoyed your talk this morning. It's very stimulating for me as a reformed journalist turned into an academic. And I have one ray of hope, at least for the biomedical sciences in my country, in the US. The agencies that give us the funds, the National Institutes of Health, has changed its way of measuring what we do. So they're still interested in us doing things that are innovative science, but they're now asking about burden, need, and impact. So what's the burden of illness, for example? What's the need of people for a new medical or scientific solution? And then what impact we have? And what's interesting is that impact conventionally was measured by, did you publish in prestigious journals? But now they're using software to measure our impact by the number of hits we have on the press release, whether it's picked up as stories in the media, what kind of play it gets. It ends up being now one of the measures that our own National Institutes of Health uses to define success. Now, in pure academia, you won't get promoted in academia doing just that, having good press coverage, but it is now part of the equation.
So you have an incentive to sensationalize your results.
Well, potentially, yes. I wouldn't be quite that cynical, but I do believe that it is changing the balance of how we think about what is done with our data in the end.
Awesome. Thank you.